It's this really abstract way of getting at the subcortex, which is where we generate a lot of hormones and neurochemicals, where if you stimulate these areas in a rat and give the rat the bar will press the bar and press the bar and press the bar and die rather than eat. Right, the classic Olds-Milner experiment. So what the supramodal areas in that top-down projection are doing are going back down to the subcortex with some sign saying there's a positive or a negative emotion, and then generating excitement, changes in heart rate, and so forth, top-down. All right, what about the referentialist route? Well, the referentialist route has to do with associations with people and past events. So things that are very much related to cultural norms. The music, I mean, you would never play music from a holiday at a funeral, right? There's wedding songs, you know, oh, that was the song that was playing the first time I kissed a girl. Those sorts of associations where there's a reference not necessarily intramusical but extramusical to something that happened outside of the realm of music. And by activating those associations and representations, there are projections from those temporal areas that are part of the supramodal past system to the subcortex to again evoke changes in heart rate and so forth. Now, I think that this is actually an incomplete picture of emotion and meaning in music, and I don't know that we can blame Leonard as much because he was very pre-MTV, right? So, but he wasn't pre-theater, and he wasn't pre-dance. So the fact of the matter is that music is not only about hearing. And there are cultures, I was asking Professor Akambo about this, and Kenya is one of them, where there aren't separate words in the lexicon for music and dance. So when you hear a piece of music or you dance to a piece of music, your body is moving, right? What happens when you start exercising your body? Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, you start sweating, and you feel those things. So there's a feedback loop that comes from your body back to your brain saying, I'm excited. So kinetics and kinesthetics, which really belong to the modality-specific areas having to do with movement and touch, those areas are involved as well, and they contribute to emotion and its visceral concomitants. Visceral concomitants, I mean, you know, heart rate, goosebumps, chills down the spine, those sorts of things. And similarly, visual perception, right? Stage design, scene lighting, dance, the way that you look. You know, Joe and I and a bunch of us here, we may love the Beatles' music, but when they made it, the look was important, right? It changed the way men wore their hair, and they wore high heels, albeit in suits and ties. This is, you know, now on MTV, it's like, you know, you don't wear clothes and you can sell records. So you have to look good, right? Looking good is part of selling the song. That's visual. So visual perception cannot be divorced from music processing in the holistic sense. So all of these different modalities are contributing to the generation of emotion and activation of these visceral concomitants. It's not purely the absolutist and referentialist route. I would think of them more as sort of the multimodal means of activating emotion and visceral concomitants. A tough nut to crack has been personality and preference. We tend to think, because of work done with lesion effects, I have a case, I don't think we're going to have time to get to it, of this area at the bottom of the frontal lobe here, which if you have damage there, your personality changes. You know, there's a famous case of Phineas Gage, who had a tamping iron go through his mouth and out. He was working on the railroad with dynamite and it went, and it destroyed this part of the frontal lobe. And he went from being the foreman, who was really a terrific husband and worker and reliable, to basically joining the circus, so leaving his wife. And so we think this has something to do with this, but we really have, I think in neuroscience, really don't have a good understanding about, there's basically in neuroscience it applies as in, in general, there's no accounting for taste. Right? It's probably the ventromedial areas. All right, so I just got the 5-minute sign, so I'm going to skip a lot of slides because I do want to get to some of the more health-related or medicine-related part of my talk. Okay. So, how do you get blood from a tiny baby? So, currently, in the United States and Europe, 12% of babies are born prematurely. So 1 out of 8 babies. And when you're born prematurely, you always have a blood test. I mean, even if you're not sick, which is what the study that we did in premature infants, they weren't critically ill or anything. But how do you get blood from a baby? Does anybody know? We didn't talk about in the car. Okay. The veins are too small. Yeah. Yeah. You grab the foot, you take a needle, you stab it in the heel and squeeze. It's like when I was a medical student and doing my peds rotation, it was like, what? Or you got to be kidding. And what do you think the baby does? So when Nightline covered our study, they put this baby here. This is a baby from the study, okay? It's not, Nightline didn't want to show this as, the picture to yoke up with doing this research. So there's a really big problem in neonatology of how to deal with pain and stress in premature infants. And don't forget the babies who are in the neonatal ICUs, they'll get a heel stick, 1 to 3 heel sticks a day. And you can't give them painkillers. You can't adequately numb the spot where you stab them. You have to squeeze for a while. I was interested in that from a medical perspective, but also from the innateness standpoint. A lot of what I've said about auditory perception and music and emotion and meaning has been demonstrated experimentally that you do not have to be a musician, of course, to apprehend emotion and meaning in music. It's universal. Every culture has it. So what about the innateness argument? Well, there was a study done in Boston a few years ago by Marcel Zentner and Jerry Kagan. Jerry's one who's like fancy. He's like this hero of child visual perception, infant visual. The infants like round faces. That's Jerry Kagan. So Jerry had a postdoc come from Germany who said, well, what about music? And Marcel had a great idea. He had 2 types of stimuli. The way these experiments are done are, let's say you put a loudspeaker behind a bullseye. And the baby looks at the bullseye, and then you turn the music on. And you measure how long the baby looks at the bullseye. And also if the elbows flex or the hips flex. So these are 4-month-olds sitting on their mother's lap. And Marcel had some great stimuli. He did basically lullaby-like songs. So one of the stimuli would be something like, okay, the other stimulus, and looking at the response of the babies, was, let's see if I can even do it, because my cognitive representation of this is so weak. You never play this. So one is with all thirds, major or minor, and the other is with all minor seconds, which are traditionally dissonant intervals. And what they showed that even by 4 months of age, the babies looked longer at the bullseye, when it was the consonant version in thirds. But when it was the minor second version, you know, all hell broke loose. The elbows flexed, the hips flexed, they cried, they turned away from the thing. So by 4 months of age, they demonstrated preferences for what in Western music we call consonant musical intervals and simple songs made up of those intervals. But we can hear from about halfway through gestation in the womb. The auditory system is functional from about month 5 forward. So these babies had been exposed, never mind the 4 months post-birth, which is a lot, but also a little bit prenatally. So I was interested in the innateness argument. I said, well, you know, we have premature infants. They're like minus 1 month old. You know, they're like minus 2 months old. So why don't we see if we can look at whether they're sensitive to music in terms of heart rate or oxygenation or respiration after a heel stick. Now, for those of you who ever have done an experiment, it's like a great paradigm because they're like a petri dish or a rat. They're hooked up to a heart monitor. They're in an incubator. It's a very controlled environment. The heel stick is an event, so time 0 is very clear, right? And what we did was, at time 0, for 10 minutes, nothing, which is the control. So we talk about randomized controlled experiments. When a baby would come to the level 2 nursery in the neonatology ward at Mass General, we flipped a coin. And, you know, heads they were controls, tails they were going to get the treatment. So the controls were no music. And the treatment group was, I chose lullabies because they have both speech or song and musical instruments. The tempo was moderate, the arrangement was simple, it was very consonant, it was, you know, made sense ethologically in Boston to play lullabies. And what we found was that if we played music for 10 minutes after the heel stick, their heart rate was significantly lower than if we didn't play music. Another reason it's a good paradigm is because when they get stabbed, the heart rate goes through the roof, right? So you have a nice measure that you can tap into to see if there's an effect on heart rate. So their heart rate goes through the roof immediately after skin puncture, but if you average the heart rate over the next 10 minutes, it's significantly lower if you play the music than if you don't. This is some of the work that was funded by the Grammy Foundation. It's in music and medicine this year. The next step that we want to do is try to explore what types of music might work, what might not, because that would get even a little closer to the innateness question. For example, are there innate preferences for harmonic combinations of frequencies that make up consonant musical intervals as opposed to inharmonic combinations? Or is it just an auditory teddy bear effect? Like you could play anything, but as long as they're distracted by sound, or you know, with the mother's speech, you can actually get their sounds recorded in the womb. So, you know, women have signed up and had microphones put through the cervix into the uterus, and minutes of recordings have been made. So you can even play, you know, womb-filtered sounds to the baby and see if that works better than music. So it's a track that we really want to develop. The really important part of it is that, you know, there are like hundreds of thousands of babies around the world getting stabbed, and nobody's doing anything about it. So if we can develop a protocol that's easy for nurses to use, or device